Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. I'm Shalini Verma. In this edition of Insight, we are going to talk about the the clashes that are going on in Egypt following a football verdict. We know that about 22 people were killed on Saturday in Egypt in a violence that engulfed the Egypt's canal city of Port Said, which erupted after a court sentenced about 21 football fans to death for last year's post-match riot. We'll talk about this as well as what exactly lies ahead in Egypt for the establishment, as well as what really this verdict particularly means for the country. And joining me in the studio is Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He is Dean and Professor of Jindal School of International Affairs. Let's start the discussion with you, Dr. Chaulia. What exactly is your understanding of the clashes that are going on in Egypt?
Well, I think the soccer riots and soccer hooliganism is part of the story, which itself is politicized. If you rewind to February of last year when this incident had happened, it was all telegraphed, very graphic pictures of home fans, attacking the visitors, including the footballers on the ground who barely escaped. It was seen that the security forces were just watching on standby mode and allowed all this to happen. So what was clear at the time was this is linked to the military rule at the time of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And in that transition period, thugs and hooligans were being let loose to create this kind of chaos environment. And now, in hindsight, it's obvious that this verdict, I think, did justice. It named some of these criminals who were armed last year by the by forces allied to the former regime of Hosni Mubarak. So Port Said, one aspect of it, in fact, yesterday, the last few days, the rioting has been accompanied by chanting and slogans saying, we want the people want Port Said to be a separate state and break away from Egypt. And these kind of tendencies, vociferous tendencies, clearly are linked to creating this state of chaos. So I think the government is justified. President Morsi is justified insofar as he says that rule of law must prevail, as in if a court verdict must be respected. And the other sad aspect of this is that the fans were saying that people in Cairo were cheering at the death sentence being given to our brothers. So again, these divisions have been creeping up, and many of these are fueled by the economic crisis and the youth and unemployment. I mean, most of these soccer fans are young people who are without jobs.
So the Egyptian society more or less remains polarized 2 years after the major uprising that we saw in this country. And of course, this also was marked by the second anniversary of this protest. But many of the promises remains unfulfilled, as our panelists also said in the previous segment, that either it's the economic conditions, the problems like unemployment and others which are really badly affecting the society here. But Dr. Chaulia, what would you make out of the stand, the various stakeholders, the kind of management that has been done, and the army factor which Dr. Awad was talking about?
Well, thus far they've only used the police as the first barricade against the mobs, and the armed forces have not been pressed into service in the most recent clashes that's been happening. And I think to an extent the Brotherhood had succeeded in taming some of the military elements. Remember the Field Marshal Tantawi was forced to retire and all these things had happened. But then I think both this one and during the recent constitution related crisis that had happened where there were mass protests, there are indications that security forces, some of the officers were supposed to be hand in glove with some of the protesters too. So while the Brotherhood has its own fundamentalist agenda, the so-called secular forces or the liberal forces, even though they may not have a majority in terms of like electoral numbers, because the constitution had passed through the referendum, they do, circumstantially, they do have something in common with the military, which is always scared of the Brotherhood and its Islamist agenda. So what we have here is a kind of a divided field, and just going back to the management of the situation, what is clear is that Morsi seems to be learning rather late that he must consult much more and faster with a diverse set of actors. He has called for national dialogue and so on, but it's falling on deaf ears because, you know, the liberal and so-called secular actors and the protesters, especially in Cairo, not so much in Port Said, are, you know, uncompromising themselves. So you have this kind of like total deadlock. And the football is just become a kind, it's a political football literally now.
Right.
Simply because some of these clubs were allied with pro-regime or anti-regime factions in the past and are being used as cannon fodder to perpetuate violence. So what we can clearly say now is whose agenda is it? Who's benefiting from this chaos? The regime says that this is all a plot, but at the same time we know that people have a lot of frustrations.
But since it happened during the time when there was this transition happening in Egypt, people were completely against Hosni Mubarak. So many things happened. The uprising happened. 18 days later, he was forced to quit the place. Do you see that there was some sort of, let's say, support that the Hosni Mubarak regime would have given to this clash there in February last year?
Yeah, the ancien regime, as it's called. I mean, there are two ways of accomplishing political change. One is through complete annihilation of the past through violent conflict that goes on for centuries, or the other is like Egypt kind of transition. And the latter case, the old elements are still there, and many of them have adjusted to the new reality and are trying to get along. The ones who have the most to lose, military top brass and so on, you see, it's a choice they have to make at this point. Are they out here to act as stabilizers and guardians of the system so that it makes a smooth transition, or are they out as spoilsports? And the evidence is mixed. The performance of the police and the security forces has not been outstanding. In fact, most people allege that, you know, see, very conceptually, the Aman Dawla, that's the state security, was the #1 concern during Mubarak's time for all the police and the armed forces. And now they have just called Watan-e-Dawla, you know, they've just changed it a little bit to call it national security in terms of state security. But the regime first agenda and the regime first ideology, which is if people are in threat, don't worry, we must first protect the government buildings and the government property and the state elites and the VIPs because they are the ultimate, you know, guarantors of stability. So this ideology of the security forces has not been changed or shaken by the revolution. So the transition means that they continue on the same old ethic of regime first. But then the people are asking, you know, where is our security? People are getting killed, not VIPs.
Right. So this uprising that we saw in Egypt, of course, many people, hundreds of thousands of people really wanted, they demanded new jobs, they wanted education, they wanted the right to form political parties, a free press, end of dictatorship. But of course, we know that much of them today feel that the leader whom they have is not, of course, their leader. And that's what appears to be one of the biggest challenges ahead of Mohammed Morsi there, to convince all the Egyptian people that he's a leader for all the Egyptians, since there are a lot of divisions in the society too. But one of the biggest reasons that we started our discussion with about the clashes there in Egypt is, of course, the deepening economic crisis. And that's where probably the Morsi government has failed to deliver. And that's where probably they should be really working on. But are they really serious about it? And what exactly is the economic scenario there? Dr. Awad did talk about the tourism sector and other areas.
Well, agriculture is a backbone. You know, Egypt is the land of the Nile. And in fact, these canal provinces where these uprisings have happened have been neglected for a long time. So there is a tendency for many people to think...
An emergency has been declared in these areas now.
So there is a lot of grievance that is building up related to that centralization that Dr. Mohammed was mentioning earlier, which is that, you know, some of the provinces are feeling the heat of the economic crisis much harder. If you remember, even wind back to the global economic crisis, because Mubarak had integrated Egypt very closely with the IMF and with the, you know, Western financial sector, and was trying to develop this whole capital markets and all those things. And once those things crashed, and combined with the food price inflation that started 2008, 2009, you know, that was the last straw on the camel's back as far as the old regime's capacity to provide for the people was concerned. So now the new regime, you know, the questions are open. I mean, youth unemployment is probably like 25 or 30%. It's as bad as Spain. And then certainly levels of poverty have increased. There's also feminization of poverty, which is a global phenomenon, but especially so in Egypt. If in fact, if you ask the feminist authors, they'll say that, you know, the women of Egypt, despite being at the forefront of the revolution, have gotten the raw deal out of the whole thing, both in terms of the constitutional provisions as well as the overall ability for creating more equal economic opportunities for them. So these are the riots and these clashes. We have lost count of bodies now. There are like so many deaths happening. Every week there is a protest and 50, 70, 100 killed. So what is the meaning of this? One is, if you remember, Iraq also came through this phase. 2006, 2007 was the worst, and over time it has declined. So I'm only hopeful. What do they need to do? They need to fix, for example, the textile sector, major employer of people. Egypt has always had one. Those are the kind of, you have to think about growth, because even Mubarak's time they were showing 5% growth. What is the meaning of the 5% growth? Right? The IMF was giving them certificates and patting them on the back. The point is people were not happy. So it's not just about reviving growth. It's about creating opportunities for people. Otherwise, we'll have jobless growth and the same kind of crises that are affecting the Western world, now compounded even more because the regional players and their vested interests. This is open war.
Exactly. But there are a lot of challenges that lies ahead of Mr. Morsi's regime, and that's what will also trigger the kind of response that that the people might show in the upcoming elections. Is there any scope or any space or time left for some sort of course correction?
Yeah, they must fast forward and fast track job creation. It's an obvious solution to this. They're still dependent on Western aid, and to now aid coming from the Gulf. They should also look at indigenous sources. Egypt is a rich country, in terms of its natural wealth, in terms of its resources, in terms of its people. So, leadership is the one in this kind of crisis, which is say, 85 million people. This is my real strength. I've got to create the skills, in the population so that they are able to compete in a fast-growing region, mind you. The rest of the countries have relatively high growth. So, and as I said before, the growth that is meaningful to people's lives, not a fictional one that, keeps the stock markets high.
Right.
So we need to create all that. And that's the only way out. And of course, the time frame for that kind of turnaround has to be medium term, as in like 5 to 10 years at least. Iraq, for example, is barely, it's got its oil economy back, but the frustrations are even still there so many years down the line since the old regime of Saddam was toppled. So we will need, to have some patience. But the only fear is that in the process, the saboteurs and the spoilsports are such that they can ignite so much violence that there's no possibility of this developmental agenda that I'm laying out to actually be fulfilled. So true leadership, I'm not very confident about Morsi doing it. True leadership will have to be, one which places a faith in the people's abilities and the human capital of Egypt.
But who will provide that true leadership?
It has to come, I think, it has to come out of people's movements only. People's movements which are non-violent. Okay, right now, I'm not talking of the soccer hooligans. It's not really a movement. They're just hired thugs. What I'm talking about is, we have, if you ask people like Nawal al-Saadawi, you ask the feminists, you ask the workers, the trade unions, which had been weakened during Mubarak's time, you have to ask student movement, even if they are liberal, you have to create a new kind of, leadership and consensus on the grassroots to change the course of this country. Because, top-down efforts, Egypt has been used about it since Nasser's time, have not worked. We have to change, and we have to create, because what is the meaning of democracy after all? People power not in this form, where they're taking to the streets and, facing tear gas and also lobbing grenades and weapons. But people power in a way that, creates a kind of a civic dialogue at the society level, and that creates some kind of, non-violent alternative where, people can grow. So it might sound idealistic, but we need to create this. Unless we nurture this out of chaos, what we have is continued mayhem. We should have the BRICS Development Bank, for example, lending to creating a new Egypt. The proposed BRICS Development Bank, India, China, we should play a role. We should not leave it off to the IMF.
A lot of ways in which this problem can be addressed and can be handled. Well, we'll certainly have to wait to see as to how things transpire in Egypt now. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for talking to us. Quite a pleasure having you here.